Welcome to the Editor's Podcast for the Journal of the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. I am Dr. Linda Snetselaar, Editor-in-Chief of the journal. During this particular podcast, we will be discussing an article titled Sex and Gender Data Collection in Nutrition Research, Considerations Through an Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Access Lens. Today, I have with me Heather Schier, who is a graduate research associate in the Department of Human Sciences in the Human Nutrition Program at Ohio State University. And what I would like to do in the next few minutes is ask her a few questions that are based on this article. And welcome, Heather, to the podcast today.
Thanks so much for having me.
So to begin, you describe the steps nutrition researchers should take when designing their studies, particularly in regard to data collection where they're talking about sex and gender. Please, would you describe those steps for us?
Sure, yeah. So first, we need to carefully consider how we're using the term sex and gender. So often these terms are conflated and used interchangeably. However, they are distinct constructs where sex is assigned at birth, often based on assessment of external genitalia and reproductive organs, whereas gender is a social construct that refers to one's sense of self and how one relates to the world with respect to gender. And an important distinction is that while sex is biologically determined, sex is more complex and fluid and is really impacted by many factors. Therefore, we're advocating that when collecting data, if subjects can be differentiated by sex and gender, and doing so is relevant to the research objective and the privacy of that data is maintained, we're encouraging capturing sex and gender separately, using a two-step approach where respondents self-select their sex assigned at birth, and then they self-select their current gender with more inclusive response options, as well as a write-in option to allow for autonomy and to self-identify without restriction. And one example of doing so has been reported by the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. They published a report back in March that outlines a really nice example of what can be used, and we highlight that in the paper. And then the final step is reporting on that data after we collect it. So the sex and gender equity in research guidelines offers some recommendations on how to report sex and gender throughout the research process, right? So everything from the title through your discussion section. For example, disaggregating data by sex and gender in the results section so we can understand if and to what degree there are differences based on sex and gender.
How might researchers go about designing their questionnaires when they're beginning to plan research in this area?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that's where a lot of folks are kind of pausing right now and wanting to understand how we can do a better job. So as I mentioned, the National Academies has a great report that offers the kind of the most up-to-date, most evidence-based recommendation on collecting sex and gender separately. So I would definitely advise folks to check out that report. It's not completely inclusive in terms of we're not seeing all genders represented in that. However, the report does a nice job of outlining why that is, and it just speaks to kind of the limitations of the current data that we have. So I would definitely encourage folks to consider that report. And when considering whether inclusion of these questions is right for our design study, it can be helpful to consider these 5 guiding principles that are also outlined in the report. So inclusiveness as a notion of all people deserve to count and be counted. Precision, so the use of precise terminology to accurately capture the complex and multi-dimensional nature of sex and gender, as well as sexual orientation. Autonomy, right? So respect for a person's identity or sense of self. Parsimony, or that notion of only collecting necessary data, and then of course privacy. So collecting data in a way that respects the privacy and confidentiality of that data. So I think when thinking through how do we design our questionnaires, what data should we collect and should we not collect, I think those 5 guiding principles can be really helpful. And of course, with any design decision, we're going to lean on our research question and our sample frame and the implications of collecting that data as well. So I think the research question in many ways will help direct folks as to what data is critical to collect. For example, if you're interested in adherence to food safety protocols across school districts, collecting sex and gender of nutrition staff or administrators may not be necessary to answering your research question. However, if you're exploring independent eating occasions of youth, then certainly sex and gender could both be valuable, and we would encourage folks to consider collecting both sex and gender, beyond just the male and female binary.
You talked about some of the resources available. Are there other resources available to researchers as they're working in this area?
Yeah, so again, definitely recommending the National Academies report and the Sex and Gender Equity and Research Guidelines. Another great resource is the Williams Institute through the University of California, San Francisco. They offer great resources around these topics, particularly related to inclusive language. And then for dietitians out there who are interested in some more of the clinical implications, I would definitely direct folks to Dr. Whitney Linsenmeyer's work. She's published some great pieces that help guide folks on how to create a more gender-affirming space and how to kind of use clinical judgment when you are serving a gender-diverse population.
To ensure inclusion, what data should be collected?
Yeah, so if adopting the National Academy's recommendation for querying sex and gender separately, one key piece is that a write-in option is included. For example, the current recommendations include response options for gender as female, male, transgender, two-spirit, don't know, prefer not to answer, and then a write-in option. So clearly all genders are not represented in those responses. However, having that write-in option is really key to ensuring that respondents can be accurately represented and offers an opportunity to continue testing the validity of expanded response options as well. So that is definitely something I would keep in mind, trying to really keep inclusion at the forefront when collecting data. And again, it's not always necessary to collect this data. So I don't want our message to come across that this should be done by all in all cases. Again, I think it depends on the design, and it's important to reflect on those 5 guiding principles as well when making that decision of kind of that delicate line between inclusion and kind of parsimony and privacy issues.
Thank you. Very important. My final question relates to how clinical RDNs might use research data, specifically the kinds of data that you have just described to us.
Yeah, so this is the exciting part, right? The application of this data. So one major benefit of collecting data on sex and gender separately is that we begin to understand how and to what degree gender impacts nutrition-related experiences and outcomes. So as we see allied health professionals and researchers adopt this approach of collecting both sex and gender, we can begin to harmonize data across genders to better understand how we can tailor our nutrition care practices and education for gender diverse folks. And ultimately, right, that's going to lead to improved nutrition related health outcomes and health equity. Right, so unfortunately, as many are probably aware, there are apparent health disparities with the trans and gender diverse population. For example, disproportionate experiences of food insecurity and disordered eating, often secondary to stigma and discrimination. So starting to collect this data is going to help us identify those pathways and solutions for these subgroups. And I think also there is a real opportunity for dietitians to consider how they can create an affirming space for their clients. And one of those steps is definitely related to how we collect data. So, for example, offering folks inclusive gender response options and space to input their correct name if it deviates from their legal name on intake forms. And then simple things like offering your pronouns and asking your clients for their pronouns. Those small things can really go a long way. So it's not just on the research front, but also in that practice, in that clinical practice application where we can be applying some of these tactics to just create a more gender affirming space for our trans and gender diverse friends and family.
Thank you. So important. And I know that your advice will be used by many practicing RDNs. In closing, I want to thank you for providing these insights into particularly questionnaire design, which is so important to the research that we do. And that concept of inclusion is immensely important, and your ideas and your thoughts around that are very much appreciated. I think also that as we look at sex and gender in terms of data collection, that is becoming more and more important as we do nutrition research. And your article, I think, along with this podcast, provides a lot of extremely important ideas as we do data collection. So many thanks, and a wish for continued success in this area of nutrition and dietetics research.
All right, thank you so much for having me.